Hello, I'm Carol Reese. As you read there on your slide, the Ornamental Horticulture Specialist for the Western region here for UT Extension. And I'll be glad to help you with any further information after this presentation. You can contact me for example, helpful list that will include some of the plants we're going to cover today. My purpose today is to talk about some of these plants that we continue to see problems with in the landscape. And rather than just continue to throw our chemical controls at these plants and struggle with them, maybe we could just consider replacing them with plants that would not require it in our continuing efforts to evolve to a more sustainable landscape and reduce our pesticide use, which is a valuable thing for our customers too. So we will go on. I want to talk about for just a moment that you should, whenever you have an opportunity, visit our display gardens and understand that what we do here is try to help you avoid those plants that are problematic. So we sort of kill plants for you and then provide you with that information about which ones have been a struggle to control. We encourage you to come around and walk around the gardens on your own at any time, but if you want to contact us for a personalized tour, for one thing, it's not just to see which ones do well in our particular climate, because it's a challenging climate here with very hot summers, sometimes drought, sometimes very wet, sometimes cold winters, sudden snaps. So we provide that information, but we also, the eventual size, what size do these plants actually get? Because often that label information is inaccurate and you may use plants differently than what you had assumed would be the performance of that plant. So I know, how big does it get and how fast does it get big, or will it stay smaller for us when that's the desirable thing? So we're looking at performance, we're looking at size. We're also using this to help promote these better plants to the public so that they ask for them, so that these plants that deserve wider use are promoted both to the commercial industry and to the public. So those of you who are trying to sell plants can see that when people really like these plants, and they can go to your garden center or retail operation and ask for those plants. So we do a lot here at the gardens, and we hope that you will realize that they are here for you to help you with your decisions on these plants. And again, realize any time of year is a good time, because if you want interesting landscapes in winter, and this is a shot of our parking lot bed on a cold winter day, you can see there are lots of great plants here that provide seasonal interest, which is another way you can promote your businesses to your clientele. Oh, reasons we might not want to use some of these plants in our landscape: it's going to be just not the right one for our climate. It may, survive our winters, but will it take our hot, humid summers, or will it succumb to disease without a whole lot of pampering? So we have to make sure we have those regional adapted plants, or they might survive, but they're just, irritating plants. They have other issues, that they just drop litter on the lawn, and the growth habit wasn't what it was promised, and it just didn't perform the way it did. So we're not real happy about that plant in our landscape, or don't want to have to deal with that litter problem all the time from defoliating earlier than it was supposed to. Targets of pest and disease that kill or disfigure, and that's probably one of the things we're going to talk about mostly today. These plants that consistently have these same issues over and over, and I'm just thinking, if you have to replace them or you have to go spray them, why would you? Let's talk about some options that are certainly lower maintenance. Japanese hollies, I just rarely see a big, healthy Japanese holly. Hellerii, compacta were big ones in the landscape when I first started my career, and then people kind of quit using those, and they claimed that soft touch was a better option. But honestly, Japanese hollies tend to have real black root issues, and it is a problem, and they cannot tolerate the least little problem with drainage. They're going to go out on you, and this is what happens. Now, when I started here at the experiment station, there were Japanese hollies around the building, and they were slowly dying, and there was just wasn't anything we could do. We tried treating the soils and such, and finally, the best option was to replace. So what would we replace that with? If we want a a nice compact evergreen plant. I'm going to give you several options. Oh, and yeah, first of all, let's look at some of the ones that are still out there. It's hard to resist that sky pencil holly because I do love that vertical effect. And these Japanese hollies are somewhat shade tolerant. And they honestly really perform pretty well sometimes in a pot for me, the sky pencil, for example, when I want a strong vertical. But if I'm going to try to use it in the landscape, I'm going to plant high. I'm going to really mound it up. And again, I might look for other options. So boxwood's kind of the same way. We're going to throw that in there, although I want this caveat. I am not against using boxwoods in the landscape where they're used properly because they are fairly demanding on site. They need to really have extremely good drainage. They don't want too much hot sun. They don't want too much cold winter wind. And also certain cultivars are more tolerant than others. This is the little Fructicosa, which is supposed to stay small, and it is often very problematic. It seems to be very sensitive with some of the boxwood problems. So we're going to talk about these plants that, yeah, let's use them, but let's be careful about which cultivar we get, and let's be really careful about where we place them so that their cultural needs are met. And then they should really be good plants if we do that, whereas others are just always going to be a problem no matter how well you plant them and site them. So one of the problems I see with boxwood that often is actually a cultural issue. It's not a disease or an insect, and that is that it's subjected to poor pruning practices. We do not want to be trimming our boxwoods late in the growing season. So my cutoff period is usually there around late summer, August. I stop pruning any broadleaf evergreens because they're going to still have plenty of time to flush out new growth, especially in some of these irrigated beds. And that new growth will not harden off before the frost, so they're going to get burnt back and look terrible. So that's another thing we need to consider when we decide is boxwood a good plant or a bad plant. Maybe something that we're doing that we just need to change our practices, so not necessarily a terrible plant. Also, when we're looking at these full sun sites, let's look more for those the little leaf boxwoods, the japonicas and the microphyllus and the corianas and those very high multi-hybrids in there, whereas the old English boxwood is what I was taught to call it, or common box. Some people call it American box, is more prone to bronzing either in hot sun or in cold winter winds. So again, let's choose the right boxwood for the job. And this is a beautiful plant. I'm not denying it, and I love boxwood and have some. I just want to be sure that they're put where they're going to keep me from having all those calls that I get. Sometimes they're put into a new landscape where they're receiving too much irrigation, and we can just talk about how to maybe plant them high if they're going to be in that kind of situation, or cut back on that irrigation. Another one that was real common around here, and well, gosh, many places. Autoleucon, big time. You know, we kind of always knew shot hole fungus was an issue. We get the little holes in the leaves that don't kill it. And if we had the plant in good drainage, it was a good looking plant. But over the years, it's become more and more often a target of the peachtree borer. It was like the peachtree borer didn't particularly care for the cherry laurels, and then over time, there were so many of them in the landscape, and I think we do this a lot. We created an environment that encouraged peachtree borer to seek out these cherry laurels. It was able to prolifically reproduce because we had, you know, parking lots lined with them. We had them all around these big buildings. So we encourage that population. So now, often when I go look at a problem with cherry laurel, it's going to be the peachtree borer, and I can tell when I look down in that plant and find the dying limbs and go back and go all the way down to that base, and I find the damage inflicted by those borers. You don't always see the borer. Sometimes you'll see the frass, which is the little poop of the bark that they have consumed and pooped down at the base of the plant. You can find that frass sometimes lodged in the crotches down there. But peachtree borer is very difficult to treat. It has to be a very timed application. The systemics are not going to be useful on your peachtree borer. So you really would just do better to replace it with some other plants that are not subject. Because everything in the prunus, any of our, you know, peaches, pears, plums are all going to get peachtree borer. Another one I've seen issues with is Indian hawthorn, because number one, it's really borderline hardy here in Tennessee. And we kind of got away with it because we've had some warmer winters, but a cold snap will really knock them back. But also they're subject to Entomosporium leaf spot, same thing that's affected our red-tip photinias. And can it be prevented if we spray regularly? Yes, who wants to do that? And if you don't go ahead and start spraying preventively from very early in the spring, it's going to get the leaf spot. So spraying later in the spring doesn't do any good. I just don't recommend it. I just think it's not a great plant for our area, and I'd rather use something else. And number one on that list is going to be our so-called dwarf yellow pine. Now remember, dwarf is relative. In the wild, when you start finding this is a native holly that you'll start finding down along the Gulf states, about halfway down through Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, it's going to be a tree, a small tree, a large upright shrub. And the dwarf forms are just naturally these wonderful little tiny compacts. Well, let me remove the word tiny, because they don't stop growing. They may grow slower, and they may stay compact and tight, but they're going to grow every year, and eventually they're going to get big. I've seen some taller than I am. I'm 5.5 feet. So these, in fact, the ones in this slide, were cut back all the way to the ground several years before this picture was made. And because the big root systems pushed them back out so fast, pretty soon they were over those lights once again out in that parking lot. So dwarf is a relative term. Compact's a relative term. It means more so than the species. It doesn't mean it's always going to stay small as you'd like. So let's remember that. The good news about the yellow pine hollies is you'll find them in the wild in wet, dry, sunny, or shady sites. They're going to be fuller. They're going to be better looking plants perhaps in those sunnier sites and those better soils, but they're pretty tolerant of most any place you put them. So you got to replace those Japanese hollies or those hawthorns. Yellow pine, if you just want a good, solid, reliable evergreen that looks pretty much the same throughout the year, which is probably its only thing I don't like. It can be a little boring. Then this is my go-to, absolutely my go-to. Just be prepared. It may get bigger than you realize over time. I love the little nandinas. There's many little dwarf nandinas that do a good job and look beautiful year-round. I'm not a huge fan of firepower. To me, it always looks a little lumpy and virus-ish. But harbor dwarf, I've got planted out here to stay low beneath some signs that we had. It's a fruitless form for those people who are concerned. There's a lot of, I'll call it myth, running around out there about the horrible toxicity of nandina berries, because it was one time that it was noted to kill some birds when it had been a frost, which concentrated the cyanide in those berries, but it was something really that normally never ever happens. The reason you might want to be concerned about the fruit is that it has the possibility of reseeding out into our natural areas and becoming a pest. So realize there are fruitless forms out there. You can buy them. Harbor dwarf is one that does not form any kind of fruiting berry, which I kind of miss, but you know, that's probably a safer choice. And then I'm crazy about this new lemon lime because of that bright chartreusey colors. It provides me the opportunity, and later we're going to talk about replacements for knockout rose, what can provide us color all season long like it did. And I want to look at some of the foliage opportunities. So a composition of using the bright lemon lime with a darker burgundy form of dwarf nandina is one of those opportunities. And nandinas are pretty darn easy to grow on most any site. So far, no pest. I'm not going to tell you any plant is pest proof. It may be for now, but there's always something new coming down the pipe that could attack a plant and become a problem in the future. So one lesson is to always diversify, use a lot of different types of plants so that you don't get wiped out. I'm also a real fan of some of these lower growing junipers. Again, if we put them where the drainage is good, where they got good air circulation, they can be low and spreading. Now, some are going to get quite large over time, can actually be mixed into screens that were advertised on the tag as being like 4 feet tall and often are 3 times taller than that. But some of these, like Dobbs Frosted is a good example, or Algo Juniper, are going to stay low and spread. They go sideways larger than you might want, but that's easy enough to control. by taking those limbs that are too long, reaching way back in that shrub and cutting them off where you can't even tell that you've trimmed that shrub, but you have reduced it in size if it's getting on a sidewalk or something. So that retains the feathery grace. It would be an option for me to replace some of these pickier plants, again, when sited properly. There's a lot of good new abelias that are more compact. Our big old glossy abelia that I grew up with could be easily 6, 8 feet tall and might be even used as part of a screen composition. But of late, we have things like Rose Creek, which is the one on the left, extremely floriferous little mounding shrub. And they can be trimmed back if you want to reduce the size, maybe even just once a year and then let it flower freely, which it does all season, and the pollinators love it. The big old Chinese, just straight Chinese I like, but there's all kinds of opportunities for not just compact habit, but variegated foliage. And again, these are pretty cool little plants that'll tolerate some shade and still perform well and don't have to have their soil just perfect. None of these shrubs are going to really like soggy soils, but they don't have to have things just exactly right and provide a lot of benefit. I'm a big fan of Akuba. When in good drainage, for shade, it's a very reliable glossy evergreen in this area. As long as that drainage is good, striking coarse leaf, because sometimes I get tired of all the fine textured roundy moundy shrubs. So there's many Akubas, some are variegated, most people of us know those, but Rosanne is a good example of a solid green. The one called Serrata is got a narrow evergreen leaf, so if you just want a nice tall plain green shrub that's going to tolerate shade and still perform, it's one of my favorite choices. They will burn in too much hot sun, so be sure you give it some shade. And there's some gorgeous variegated forms out there. I'm, again, going to qualify this a little bit. The Globosa nana of the Cryptomeria, the little roundy moundy you see right there in the front, is one that I occasionally see issues with, but Alfred has good air circulation and good exposure to sunlight. We've had one here at the station now, probably going on close to 20 years, that has been a beautiful specimen. So might be another option for you there. One you may not be familiar with, it's a little newer in the trade, upper right, is called Distillium. And Distillium are called Distilliums in the trade, and you'll just get accustomed to the name just like you got accustomed to the word hydrangea, same number of syllables. The Distilliums are evergreen, broadleaf evergreens that will tolerate sun or shade. And the breeders have produced some in all different types of growth habits. So vintage jade, for example, emerald jade, this is emerald spreading habit. And those are the ones I look for that will stay low. Every plant starts getting taller, except those that instead of expanding upward, expand sideways. So that's a growth habit I look for when I really don't want to have to come in and prune for height. Same is true of the shrub below called Crimson Fire, Loropetalum. And the Crimson Fire will do that for you. And yes, Purple Pixie is another form of Burgundy Loropetalum that will stay low, but it is not hardy here, whereas Crimson Fire has been hardy for us all the way to Knoxville. On the far left, I want you to look at Kanoi viburnum, and the viburnums offer a lot of options. They're easy to grow, not known for any major pests or diseases. Some are evergreen. This one is Kanoi. It's going to eventually get, boxwood sized over time, continue to become a pretty good sized shrub, 4 to 6 feet, maybe tall and wide eventually, but slowly. And we have examples out here, again, that you can see of Kanoi, or if you can find the one called Pearlific, which is very similar to Kanoi, but Kanoi is more common in the trade. There's a good example of the different growth habits in Distillium, the spreading types, and you can also find large upright types that could be used as part of your screen compositions, even in shade. So Linebacker is one that, Copper Tone is one, but Linebacker is the one that is most commonly recommended. It's a very large evergreen form that would be a good potential for screen use. Spreading junipers include some of these ground cover types, which sometimes is just fine. Just put a ground cover in there and then put maybe an upright small tree instead of a row of shrubs. And Pacifica Gold is also known as All Gold, is how it originally came out. We haven't had any issues with this. This is a Juniperus converta. Stays reliably, I'd say, foot high, you know, and no taller, a little bit lower than that, 8 to 12, and just goes sideways. So great plant for maintaining that low height and looking good year round. Definitely more gold with the new growth, but keeps a nice bright green throughout the entire year. I love clear because of the gorgeous foliage. Even up close, it's shiny, and the red new tips may remind you of red tip photinia, but it doesn't have those issues, nor does it get that large. And this is a shrub that does require good drainage, but can be moved from sun to shade equally well. More compact in sun, can even form some pretty bright red berries in full sun, but performs admirably in shade. So one of my go-to choices when I need a polished looking evergreen shrub in the shade. One I feel like is underutilized is Japanese plum yew. The old yews, the true taxus, were a little more finicky about drainage, and they could certainly go out on you. The plum yews or cephalotaxus are a little bit easier to grow, and we have these wonderful growth habits in these prostrate forms, so they'll stay a nice kind of predictable height, give a ferny appearance, and will move sideways. You can find upright forms as well if you want some, which are quite beautiful. And again, we have a great collection of them here at the experiment station for you to admire. And another underutilized is winter jasmine. A shrub gets to a predictable height because it gets to maybe 4 feet or so before it begins to just weep down and form nice mounds. A favorite of mine for covering slopes because it will root where those tips touch the soil, and eventually it'll cover a slope so that it never has to be mowed. It's really not evergreen, but it looks evergreen even in the winter because it has so many dense, thick, weeping green stems. And one of the great beauties of it is it does bloom in the winter, sometimes called January jasmine, which is a little earlier than it normally blooms here, but it will be in bloom February, March, a few weeks before forsythia kicks in. Don't confuse it with Florida jasmine, which is not quite as cold hardy, and it's a summer bloomer. Winter jasmine, and a good way to tell them apart is the leaves will be opposite each other on those green stems. So Jasminum nudiflorum, flowers on the nude wood. And here you see what it looks like in flower on those bare green stems. Here it is at the experiment station. This particular planting has been taken out, but you can see maybe by looking at that crepe myrtle what its eventual size will be, because these were very old shrubs when we finally removed them to make room for that in that bed for some other plantings that we wanted to experiment with. But that was as tall as they ever got, and we didn't allow them to go any further east and west. I've already covered it. Oh, just so you know, kubas can get quite large over time. This was an amazing one I photographed over in Covington, Tennessee, that was roof high. Slowly, so I wouldn't put it in there as my #1 screen plant because it will get there slowly, but I will use it as part of my screen plant complements. So we know lelands were touted so heavily as just the world's best thing for screening, and they grow fast, and they did. All that stuff was true, and again, we planted gazoodles of them, and just like an insect may adapt quickly to what's available, a disease can as well, and so it began to be frequently affected by ceridium canker, and ceridium canker is around, and it's not much you can do to prevent it infecting your leland cypresses, and especially if they're stressed, you know, if they get drought stressed or injured or there are other reasons for stress, then that's going to move in. It starts showing as one dead limb, the whole vascular system of the tree will get killed, and eventually the whole tree turns brown and then has opportunity to move up and down the row and take you out. #1, let's diversify our screen plantings. I have a great handout. A great work group here at UT Extension has a whole brand new screen handout that is just at the point of being publicized, and we could send to you as is personally, although one day it will be actually on our website. But let's diversify our plantings with some other screen plants, but let's talk about some things that we could substitute for these ubiquitous overplanted lelands. Green giant, you know, was like, boom, okay, let's plant green giants. And it's a good plant, but again, we're setting ourselves up for trouble when we go in and replace all the lelands with all green giants, and now I'm starting to see issues on green giants, then we have fallen right back into that same trap. I'm not saying no green giants, but just use them intermittently. We're not going to give that pest opportunity to just jump from plant to plant to plant and form enormous amounts of inoculum. Let's mix it up, because you can make some beautiful, beautiful compositions that have different colors of foliage and texture and provide great privacy. And we're not in any trouble. We haven't provided opportunity for disease and insects to just go from one to the next like falling soldiers, or that missing tooth syndrome, right? If you have a row of something and one dies, you got a missing tooth. So this, if one died in here, we're not in trouble. We can plug something else in that looks good. So let's mix it up, mix it up. Somehow I want you to avoid, of course, I don't know that I see red tip Photinias used much or sold much in the trade anymore anyway. But if you do know of some that are still out there, you may notice that some are still in decline from the Entomosporium leaf spot, which can be prevented by constant spraying from the bud break on through the summer. And we don't want to have to do that. Let's just avoid those red tip Photinias. And one I hate to take off the palette for screening, beautiful, tall, dense evergreen is our cherry laurel, and the one on the form is the one called Bright and Tight, which was a favorite of mine. It was fruitless and just a stunning plant. But because we put a lot of them out there, we've got the peach tree borers, which are going to attack everything in that prunus family, and we're seeing them start to go down and go out. And I've finally gotten to the point where I'm just saying, let's don't plant them anymore. If we do, let's use them very sparingly. So take that off the palette. Another one, loblolly pines do have several issues, of course, with pests and pine bark beetles and fusiform and such. So they can be subject to problems. Usually they grow quite well, but why would you want to use them in a screen planting when eventually what they become is all trunk and top knot and no screening, right? I can see right through there into that backyard. Not to mention the fact that they're so prone to windfall. We have a good ice storm, snowstorm, windstorm. These are the trees that are going to go down. I do love the pine needles for free, so I got some on my property and I'm going to leave them there, but they're nowhere near my utility lines or house. So another one I don't want to see people planting for screens. However, the Virginia pine is great. If you've driven up down the Milan Arsenal up here, that's one they use for a whole lot of their screening around the Milan Arsenal fields and property. It'll tolerate dry, parched soils, scrubby soils where other things don't flourish. Our Virginia pine, it's little needles, it stays bunchy and tight and small and low to the ground. We don't have those problems of it snapping in ice storms and snowstorms, and its growth habit loans itself to being a good screening plant. Very well tolerated in our area to our heat too. So, and another favorite, gosh, right up there in my very tops for screening plants is a viburnum called Prague, like the city of Prague, Prague. Prague viburnum is a big, rapid growing, kind of a loosely irregular evergreen shrub that will bloom for us in the spring. Looks handsome year round. Doesn't mind some shade. Just, you know, just as long as the soil is not wet, it's going to do a great job for you mixed in as a screen. And you'll see a close up here of how handsome and shiny the leaves are. The growth habit, if it's just allowed to go unchecked and unpruned on the bottom right, a little loose for people, but still dense. I like it better than leatherleaf viburnum. To me, the foliage is more handsome, especially in the wintertime when leatherleaf can look, it stays evergreen, but it looks real unhappy. It just sort of, the foliage hangs limp through the winter, like, oh, I'm cold. Whereas the Prague viburnum looks great through the wintertime. So that Prague is a fabulous plant. May look somewhat similar in habit. This is my favorite of the large-leafed hollies, and this is the straight species lusterleaf. Lusterleaf holly, Alex latifolia. Looks almost like a magnolia. That is unpruned here at the experiment station, the dense globular habit. Not terribly rapid, but a fabulous plant for adding to your composition. Here you see the male form. If you want to have red berries, you're going to have male and female. Or you can select the form called Mary Nail, and Mary Nail actually has male and female flowers on the one holly so that it can make berries without having to have a male pollinator around. And then there's this whole group called red hollies that were the children of Mary Nell, the cardinal, uh, liberty. There's a bunch of them, but in general, they lump them all together. Oak leaf is one of them. Oak leaf holly are one of the red hollies. Called that because the new growth can sometimes look a little reddish. Dwarf magnolias are also really good plants for using in those screen plantings and mixing in for that diversified. This is Little Jim. Little Jim will be a wonderful dense pyramid if it's getting plenty of sun. It will also tolerate some wetter soils. It will tolerate some shade, though the growth habit will be more sparse. Because when you look for southern magnolia in the wild, and it is a native plant, you'll find it between here and the Gulf Coast, often in the deep shade and in those lower, wetter areas in the woodlands. State from Jackson, Mississippi on further south is where you're going to find it out in the wild, as well as some of the sweet bays. And some of those sweet bay magnolias are also evergreen and can be mixed into your screen plantings. The big southern magnolias are going to get too large for the average landscape. So look for those Little Gems. Teddy bear is another, although I like the fact that the Little Gems continue to flower throughout the whole season. So that one is my go-to, and I think the foliage is very handsome. Our old Foster holly is a good choice still. I still like a Foster holly. It's a good plant, although we'll say it's a little more picky about the pH as far as if the pH is a little high, the foliage will be a little bit yellow, where some of the other hollies that I've mentioned tend to withstand that higher pH without yellowing. So go with some Fosters as well in there. A lot of great junipers. This is the Spartan, one of the Chinese junipers, a great choice. Again, I worry about planting a row like that because if one goes missing, we're not going to find one in the right size to replace it. So let's mix it up. But Spartan's a good one. Tailors for staying narrow and going very tall. You don't have much space or you want that dramatic vertical effect. A Taylor juniper is our native eastern red cedar, which is Juniperus virginiana. And the Taylors have been truly magnificent for staying narrow and reaching for the sky. By the way, we have a columnar plant collection here at the station. You can see us there in the background. I'm sitting in that window right there. And you can come and peruse these at any time. We have both deciduous columnar plants, so you can see off to your right as you come down our driveway. There are many more columnar narrow evergreens on the other side and mixed in here, and especially around our parking lot. So come look at them, see how well they're performing. There are many of the arborvitaes and junipers when you want to find that really upright plant that you could use, and we have them labeled. Remember that some of our big spreading junipers that say 4 to 6 feet on the tag, or even sometimes 2 to 4 feet, are going to get easily 2 times that. Gray owl. This is gray owl at the Agri Center in Memphis. It's gotten just enormous. That was easily 2 times taller than I. And again, I'm 5.5 feet tall. I would say it was probably closer to 12 feet. So they can be used in your screen plants, as well as Holbert right here at the station, Holbert. Holbert would be a fantastic specimen. Angelica blue. There's some bigger ones out there that just need to mix in for that gorgeous spiky blue foliage. There's gold forms as well. This is one that I love for the fact the junipers are going to require good drainage. They don't have to be perfect soil by any means, but good drainage. Whereas this one's going to tolerate those that are less predictable as far as the drainage, and it'll go in sun or shade. This is anise tree, A-N-I-S-E tree, all written as one word. As you see, it's not a tree, it's a large shrub. I want you to be sure you get the Lycium parviflorum, which means small flowered. Parva, P-A-R-V-I-F-L-O-R-U-M, parviflorum, because that one is the best adapted and going to provide the best growth habit for us for that enormous big evergreen shrub that's going to go for you in sunshade, wet or dry, and have that handsome habit. They look a little scraggly in a pot. Give them a couple of years and they'll get like this without pruning. Here you see the different color it would be in the deep shade. It's still going to stay dense. It's still gorgeous. Nothing bothers it, but it will have a richer green and a larger leaf. It's going to be more olivey green out in the full sun. We've mentioned the distyliums just so to remind you, look for that larger one called linebacker for use in your screen plantings. Here it is. You see it's going to be a handsome addition, broadleaf evergreen, to your landscapes. And our old Yopon holly. Too often I see them used this way, right? They got planted where nobody could see out the window, so they gave them the mushroom haircut to limb them up and get them up above people's views. But left to their own, they're going to cascade down closer to the ground and be a beautiful part of that screen composition. And this native holly will go in sunshade with our dry soil. So it'll be more open, not quite as dense as it would be in full sun and great soil, but it will certainly perform for you. So here's the handsome habit. One of my favorites, really, for a lot of different reasons, but certainly should be in your screen mix. And these big loropetalums that got so big, that little hot pink bloom, people thought they were going to make cute foundation plantings. Instead, let's move them out to our screen plantings. Now, for us here in Tennessee, it's best that we plant the burgundy loropetalums in the spring to get them well established before we have a hard winter. So when they're fall planted and we have a hard winter, we can lose those. The best of the big ones for screening purposes would be Juju fuchsia, ZZ. Remember ZZ top, and maybe you'll remember Juju is the one you want for your screens. Come here and look at what we have done to create some screens that are mixed, both evergreen and deciduous material. And we have a screen planting of all evergreens also out here west of the building that you can peruse, as well as some of the flowering shrubs that you might want to mix in there for added appeal. Large trees, let's talk about avoiding pin oak. I hope you're not still using Quercus palustris, because we're going to get bacterial leaf scorch on it, and really there's not much you can do to keep it from killing the tree. Well, there's nothing. You may slow the death, but it's going to die. So let's just not use that pin oak or Quercus palustris, and let's be sure we're talking about the right oak. But some people call willow oak, Quercus phellos, pin oak. And that's not wrong. It just means we call it by different common names. When I'm talking about pin oak, I mean Quercus palustris. That other oak is Quercus phellos. So this one, not gonna work out there. Red maple, we've got issues on with borer. Tulip poplar just gets too big for most suburban landscapes. And often it will get a scale insect that drips things, little honeydew, makes a black film on everything below. So these are probably ones we want to avoid. There's the difference in willow oak on the right, Quercus phellos, sometimes called pin. What I call pin oak on the left, Quercus palustris with the sharp points. So one on the right, good, still, nothing's bothered it yet. And the one on the left is the most removed tree in Tennessee landscapes. What in the world? Red maple? We're so reliant on that. It gives us fast growth. We got great fall color, and it'll grow about anywhere we put it. But because we planted so many, it began to get targeted by borers. So when I got this call over in Hohenwald, and I drove up to meet the county agent there, all I did was glance over there, saw they were red maples. Because I wanted to know what's wrong with their street tree planting, and I said, it's going to be flat-headed borer. So we go over and look, and this is what we see, the bark scaling off predictably. And then when we peel that back, we see the engraving that the borer did as it moved around eating the cambium, which is why it died, or is dying, because we need that cambium layer for the tree. That's the vascular system that transports nutrients and water throughout the tree. It's trying to heal. We see it callousing over on the right, but if it's too damaged and it continues to happen, it's history. So we shouldn't be using red maples in the landscape now unless we're willing to treat them at time of planting, because that's often when those borers attack. Their trees are a little stressed because of transplanting, and that young thin bark on those young trees is when they're going to get targeted by these flat-headed borer. This is luckily one we can treat systemically, and we can put some neonicotinoids that will protect that tree for a year or more, and we may have to treat it for several years until perhaps that bark gets deep and fissured enough that it's no longer subject to attack. So we need to know that if we're going to continue to use them, or we could learn to diversify and use other plants. There he is doing his damage. You can see why he earned his name. Tulip poplar, I do love them. I like they're in the magnolia family. The bloom is stunning. It's our state tree. It's a great timber tree. If you got a big property, plant them out there somewhere. The Baltimore Orioles use the blooms for the nectar. It's a host plant for many of our favorite Lepidoptera species. So, but maybe not right over the house or yard in the smaller urban landscape with that honeydew dripping on everything below. Let's choose something else that's going to be easier for them to live under. There's the bacterial leaf scorch from a distance. If you see these declining and going down, the yellowing tells you probably when you get it close, you're going to see it's a pin oak. So far, other oaks, although reported to be susceptible, I have not seen them have issues with it, but let's don't overplant any of them, right? Diversify. Shumard and Nuttall are our most recommended for replacing our pin oaks. And they're fast-growing red native oaks. And Nuttall, by the way, had the most growth in unirrigated trials in McMinnville, Tennessee, and some research they did there several years ago. I'm a fan of swamp chestnut, one of my favorite oaks. Might be a little harder to find in the trade, but I love the growth habit. It's a big, beautiful tree with great color. I like the shapes of the leaves, and large, sweet acorns are very nutritious and desirable for wildlife. Here's a shot at Chihuly with the Chihuly glass exhibit in Cheekwood several years ago, echoing that beautiful fall color on our swamp chestnut oak, which is one of our faster growing oaks. So bottomland oak does fine on high and dry soils too, as so many of them do. Willow oak still maybe my go-to. It's relatively fast growing for an oak. I love the fine little textures of the leaves. It's almost bamboo-like to me sometimes, the texture of it all. Fall color's a good, decent yellow. Grew up with them, yeah, leaves, sometimes limbs start dropping below, which is true of any large tree, by the way. As those limbs are beginning to get shaded out, the tree will discard them because they're no longer producing photosynthate. They are stealing photosynthate from the rest of the plant. So that's why any big oak will eventually start dropping lower limbs. The willow oak is noted for lining many streets in many southern towns and across the country, not just southern. So a fabulous growth habit, a fabulous shade tree. Lacebark elm is a good choice. It's one that I really fell in love with when I first saw it over in Memphis Memorial Gardens and got up close and saw the gorgeous bark, the reason it's called lacebark elm. Some it's called Chinese elm, which is dangerous because then you might be talking about a different species of elm that's less desirable. So let's call it lacebark or Ulmus parvifolia. And here you can see there's differences in cultivars as far as how attractive the bark may be, and a little bit in the growth habit as well. So far, no problem with these elms. They're very good urban trees and relatively fast growing and fine textured. They can reseed. Yes, they can come up in cracks in the sidewalk and in your mulch and sidewalks, but so can most any tree I could name. If you want the least likely tree to cause damage to the house and a good reliable tree, look for no further than our swamps, which you can take right out of the swamp, plant on high and dry ground, is our cypress trees, common bulb cypress. We got this wonderful pyramidal habit. They're rumored to be slow growing, which is true in the water. They actually grow faster when you get them out on better soil. Don't believe me? It being my mother's favorite shade tree, because she said the little needles blow away in the wind and don't have to be raked. She bought bundles of them when anybody in the family would build a house on the old farm and start out in the water and then move up toward the house with the trees until they had a very naturalistic looking meandering effect as you came up. And in every case, the ones in the water grew the slowest. This is my brother's house near Starkville, Mississippi. And you can see that that is quite true. Now, it's a very safe tree because they don't blow over. I'll show you an example of that. But first, let's talk about how many different habits there are among the common bulb cypress. You can find dense, compact, like PV minaret or sentinel. You can find tall forms. You can find even weeping forms. So when you look at a natural looking grove out in the wild of them, you'll see there's a huge variety in the growth habit. Now notice how wide they'll start to get at the base. And by the way, if you plant them in dry soil, you won't have to worry about those knees. That's only going to happen in your wet areas. They spread the roots do way out in the swamps to anchor that tree in that wet and mucky soil. So basically you've got this big wide platform that is just not going to blow over in a wind. And you cannot find any record of a blown over cypress trees after hurricanes or anything. You may see that there's some of the top blown out, there may be some limbs blown out, but they don't get very big because they all whirl around that main trunk. So that tree is going to be the safest one to plant close to your houses for protection from wind. You want shade on the house, but you don't want to worry about a tree crashing through the roof. This would be the #1 choice. The fall color on them is underrated. Another shot of my brother's house from the dam shooting back toward his home. You can see once again the smaller ones that are in the water and then the larger ones as you go away from the water, and the kind of cinnamon brown, warm red fall color that they do get. Speaking of fall color, black gums are really getting big in the trade now. When I was coming along, they said, oh, they're difficult to transplant. And turns out that was just a myth. So somebody said, let's question that myth. They're noted for our fall color. They'll tolerate a wide range of soils. Females are going to provide fruit for our songbirds. Then we found forms that also have red new growth, and then also the reliable red fall color that so many of them do, not all of them. Wildfire does, and wildfire is going to give you then these different seasons of interest. You're going to get red in the spring, and then red whenever there's bursts of new growth throughout the season, and then the red fall color. So wildfire's out there and widely available in the trade. Dawn redwood looks real similar to our common bald cypress, not quite as wind firm. So Dawn redwood is not a true redwood, it's a metasequoia, not a sequoia. But it will grow more rapidly, and it has that same growth habit so that you don't have the large limbs that catch the wind, the big round habit that's going to cause blowover, and you're not going to have the enormous limbs that can cause a lot of damage when they come off of that tree. And it comes in gold. You can get you can get dawn redwood, metasequoia, in gold dawn is one of the forms out there. Gold rush and amber glow is one I have in my yard that gives you some foliage interest in a large tree. Oh, I'm sorry, this should have gone to my little black gum part, because that's one of our favorite black gums on the farm. Of those 3 trees right there, the ones on the right are persimmon. They have not yet leafed out. This is a spring photo, and the black gum is leafing out. And I need to get my brother to send me a picture of fall foliage on that particular black gum, but I like that picture because of the horses, right? Pretty. Uh-oh, okay, accidentally got all that in there twice. Troublesome small trees, Bradford pear, we know, like they split when a butterfly sneezes, somebody said, but we know when windstorms are going to go down, so we have moved away, not to mention the fact that they have, reseeded all up and down the highways and become a terrible, invasive, destructive plant. So we're going to, hopefully, we're done with those. Let's say we are, please. The cherries and the purple leaf plums are going to be prone to your borers because they are in that family. They're prunus. And then flowering dogwoods, I'm going to put that asterisk there to remind me to say they're picky. If I'm going to just, in a stressful environment, that's not the small tree I'm going to go for. I love a flowering dogwood, and I'm going to beg you to plant them. But I'm going to say, please plant them on the sites that are adapted, where that soil is good, where they can get some consistent moisture, but they're never going to stay too wet, where they have a cooler root zone, with maybe a little bit of afternoon shade, or a nice, well-mulched, wide-spreading area so that there isn't hot sun baking those roots, or don't ask it to compete with a lot of turf grass, right under the plant. Let's take care of it. So I'm going to call it finicky and troublesome because it is, if you don't really take care of its environment and make sure it doesn't get stressed, which is when it's going to get borer and other issues. The others, I'm just going to say, I don't know. Cherries, they're probably not going to last long for you. You can plant them if you want to. Just know you're going to have to go back in. Purple leaf plums have a couple of issues, but we'll get back to those. There's your borer. Your borer, if you ever grew up with the old peach tree in the yard, you've seen this. And the peach tree doesn't live a lot of years because of that. So the borer is a very difficult pest to treat, because if you don't get them when they're out of the trunk, breeding and mating and coming back to lay those eggs on that trunk. Once they're in there, very hard to deal with. There's not much you can do about it. So you have to do a preventive spray and know when to apply those preventive sprays. I'm just not going to mess with them. That's just me. Not gonna. And cankers, they get cankers as well. The prunists do very frequently. All trees can, just about, but they're very prone. But here's the other reason. See the purple leaf plum suckering all down there around the roots? This is very typical. If you weren't mowing them down constantly, then that whole yard would be an entire purple leaf plum thicket within a few years. So it's another reason I guide people away from them. Not a plant I want in my landscape. I love some purple leaf plants. I'm going to mention some coming up, but not that one. Dogwoods, again, thing of beauty, one of our amazing natives. Our University of Tennessee leads the nation on dogwood research and introduction of disease-resistant forms. So let's do plant them. Let's just take care of where we plant them. Also provide one of our very best winter foods, especially for our eastern bluebird. So it is something we do need to be planting, but let's choose resistant forms, put them in the right spot. Redbuds is good native, but it's just like sometimes people claim all natives are, easy to grow and going to be long lasting and durable. Redbuds kind of don't really fall into that category. I see them suddenly succumb sometimes, and I suspect the culprit is verticillium wilt, but then I also find some that have been out there a long, long time. And this huge native redbud is right out here next to our wood shop. It's one of the biggest ones I've ever seen. It's a really, really big trunk on that thing. You ought to come see in person. But there's also a lot of newer forms out there. But first I want to mention some of the ones that you might consider rather bulletproof at this point, till some new pest comes along. Our old oriental magnolias or deciduous magnolias, you'll hear them called by a lot of different names. Tulip tree is another one, which is not accurate and can also describe a different tree, our tulip poplar. So I like to call them oriental magnolias or oriental deciduous magnolias, and there's a bunch of them. The old one around that we see most often, Magnolia solangiana, as you see by the age of the home, how long they can live. You can also find the good crab apples. And I want you to know there are disease-resistant forms out there, but you do a little bit of research to find those. You want the ones that are resistant to scab. Their prairie fire comes to mind as one. Donald Wyman is another. So let's use those, and they are fairly bulletproof, except the fruit might be an issue if you plant it in the wrong spot. You don't want to put it where those beautiful fruits, which are good for you and for wildlife, are going to drop into your car or on your patio. But these old deciduous magnolias, the star magnolias, which we can find in shrub and tree form, can endure for many, many decades. This is an upright pyramidal form of magnolia called Wada's Memory, W-A-D-A, which is going to grow like a tall pyramid, very floriferous, and gives you the white flowers, so another one highly recommended. The fringe trees, which are going to be a little bit later in the spring than our flowering dogwood, but are said to be going to be perhaps prone to some targeting by the emerald ash borer, but that information is a little bit conflicting. Right now we're still recommending, this is Chinese fringe tree. This is the form called China Snow here in front of the station. It's much bigger than when I took this picture. Gorgeous foliage even now at this time of year. And then the American fringe tree could be another one that I'll show here. That is right out here near our wood shop. Donald Wyman is this crab apple, a nice big old specimen at Cheekwood. Large crepe myrtles could be substitutes. We're not talking about spring flowering now, but let's move into small trees that could provide other appeal. And crepe myrtles, of course, can be quite large and enough to be called definitely a tree. We got good bark and good flowers and often good fall color. Now I can't call them, trees that don't have issues anymore because of the crepe myrtle bark scale. So the crepe myrtle bark scale, you can see how it's affected the performance of the crepe myrtle on the right. The one on the left went untreated, the one on the right was treated. So they can be treated really easily. If you've got crepe myrtles of crepe myrtle bark scale, they do respond to systemic treatments. Some of the neonicotinoids can be put onto the ground and protect that tree for a year, maybe more. So if you want to have an easily treated plant that does all the good things that a crepe myrtle can do, then I continue to use them. And especially if I have an investment like this, right? Maybe some people don't want to use any pesticides anymore, and crepe myrtle used to be one of the ones we could include for them, for those landscapes. But if this were the major landscape statement I had, then I'm certainly going to treat those and preserve that. It's a relatively safe and targeted insecticide that we use to control the crepe myrtle bark scale. Understory trees, trees that are going to look right when sighted carefully, could include our Japanese maples. Some can be a little finicky and don't like our heat, can get drought stress, get caker when they do, but some that have kind of withstood the test of time here across the South, I think of as ones I would recommend more heartily. And then this is the old bloodgood. It's an ancient old bloodgood. Again, out back here, that was when the original building still stood on this site. And this one's never been limbed up into an upright tree form. So it's kind of stunning as it is out there as a huge specimen shrub, actually form of a bloodgood, but it's 25 feet tall probably, which I often see with our old bloodgoods. And you can limb them up, as you see, by removing the lower limbs and tree form them so that they do, can even make smaller shade trees over your patios and such. Sire yew is a green form, and often the green forms are a little more tolerant of our sun and heat. Sire yew is a dissected leaf, and dissected leaves can look more burned in hot sun and dry sites. So the whole leaves and the green forms are the ones I lean toward on those more stressful sites. Amber, autumn, glowing embers. Glowing embers is a large, fast-growing, upright green form that I find very, very useful. And you can see how beautiful. Sometimes these big upright, that's a Japanese maple shading half of this house, that they could be used as small trees with great ornamental appeal. The fall color on this is stunning. It's over on the other side of the hospital here in Madison County. Remember our red buds, we're seeing some new advances in breeding, can come in different colors, not just the flowers, but the foliage. So you might want to look for some of those for added seasonal interest as well. And the burgundy forms might be the replacement for that purple leaf plum we were talking about. We can find weeping purple forms. This is one called Ruby Falls. Other options would be our burgundy loropetalums, once again, the things that were sold to us as little foundation shrubs are actually going to become quite large. This is Little Ruby or Little Rose Dawn, but little was in the word when it was marketed. Mike Durr is 6'1", I think, and that's about 3 Mike Durrs. These can be limbed up and made into small upright trees if you want to create some shade opportunities underneath them. So consider those as replacements as well. Flamethrower is one of the newer red buds out there that's going to give you both purple foliage and gold foliage on the very same red bud. So on the left, you're going to see Dr. Denny Werner, who's the breeders of so many of these fantastic new red buds that were out. And this is in a field and being grown in fields in Tennessee here and looking really quite good. And we're starting to see them available in the trade. Big old bloodgood towering over these students walking around a campus. I wanted to show you the growth habit over time. And another small tree that I really enjoy for the fall color is going to be our Chinese pistache. Obviously photographed in front of the old Steinmart here in Jackson with its blazing fall color. And perhaps you can see by the texture there, it's related to sumac. So our sumacs, very tolerant of heat and drought, and so is this particular plant in those very hot, stressful parking lot situations. And let's talk about replacements for knockouts. Something that flowered all summer and didn't need to be sprayed, and oh my gosh, we don't really have that replacement. There are some good new landscape roses out there. Technically, they're all susceptible to the same rose rosette that has caused us to take out most all the knockouts in the trade. But that's, again, not overuse those, because what we did was, by planting so many knockouts, we introduced the rose rosette to the country. And we shouldn't have. And if we go wild again, planting a whole lot of roses, because they're all susceptible to rose rosette, we're going to get right back in the same thing. So let's mix it up. Let's don't give it the opportunity. Let's don't make these mono stands of any kind of rose. though some of the newer roses are coming along, look quite attractive. There we are, a typical planting devastated with rose rosette. I took this picture over in Memphis. So mix it up, and let's talk about some options for color. And let's not just talk about flowers, because remember, foliage is going to give us a lot of excitement, and it can also be year-round, not just in the summertime. And we talked about that with the nandina and the conifers, the loropetalums, the purple growths on the crimson fire, which is stunning. What if you contrast that with some of these gold shrubs that are very durable? This is a spirea called Ogon. Ogon has so many great attributes. We have a very early spring bloom, just frothing here. This picture in the parking lot out back with white flowers in early spring. And you get fall color, this peachy orange, not brilliant fall color, but certainly attractive tones of orange and apricot that are often staying on that shrub well through Christmas. So I'd say this plant gives us close to 10 months of excitement. Other golden forms of spirea are out there. A lot of you probably already know and grow: Gold Mound, Lemon Glow. There's some good ones. So pretty tough plants. I'm a fan of these yuccas because they give you that bright foliage, which is good for year-round interest and can tolerate those really hot, dry sites. Those sites where other plants struggle to survive. Your yuccas and your sedums can give you a lot of interest there. The dark foliage could be supplied by some of the many 9-barks that are now on the market. And the 9-barks are not only going to give you the dark foliage through the summer, but the flowers on the left and then these red seed heads follow the flowers and give you several more weeks of interest. So look for those. Ginger wine is one of the new ones that I'm trialing right now myself. So spring flowers maybe too, instead of our azalea, which can be quite picky and can get issues with spider mites and lace bugs when in a hot site. So our old Rose of Sharon, the Japanese Caria, is a good option, a good, tough, durable plant. The single form here called Shannon. I can't stress enough how many viburnums there are out there that provide opportunity for spring bloom and or berry interest and or evergreen foliage and or fall color. There's hundreds of them. So think about spreading your spring flowering over to some of these viburnums and beyond the azaleas that we so typically see inundating our typical landscapes around here. And here we see in our trial gardens the prolific and the Kanoi viburnums out there side by side so that you can compare them out here by the gazebo. Hydrangeas, let's talk about, people love them. We want to put them in their landscapes. So let's site them in the right spot. They've got to be where they get really good drainage. We can get these newer forms that even if we do lose the flowers in a hard winter, we're going to have rebloom. The many endless summer varieties that are out there that are also selected for good, healthy foliage, good resistance to some of these leaf spot diseases that can trouble them. So let's get the right hydrangea for the job, the tougher ones that rebloom, that have the more vigorous foliage, and let's put them where they are well drained, where they get a little shelter from the hottest parts of the day, the sun, but where they do get enough hours of daylight to stimulate flowering, of sunlight, and also of air circulation to help keep down that possibility of any fungal disease during really cool or humid times of the year. Annabelle is still a good form for us. Our good old Annabelle, we got Incrediball. These are native hydrangea arborescens. Let's just choose the right site, which means good drainage, and these are going to bloom for us reliably year after year. The paniculatus do tolerate more sun. Put them in those hotter or drier sites, and they're going to perform for us. And you can find them in a lot of forms, both compact and floriferous and tall and tree-like. So we have a huge collection of them here at the station, and I hope you'll come and peruse them, starting with the early types, in early summer, and then on through the paniculatus, which just finished blooming out here in September. So from late July all the way through September, you can observe some paniculatus in flower here. Oak leaf is also going to be here in several different places at the station, and you'll get handsome fall color as we see here. as well as summer flowers on those. And they do have the same needs of a little bit of shelter from the hot sun, but enough to stimulate flowering. There's some good butterfly bushes that could be considered, you know, long blooming, not as vivid of colors as the knockout roses, but there are many that are coming out in the trade now. We're still sorting out which ones are the more hardy of those new introductions. Miss Molly and Miss Ruby have turned out to be pretty good bets for us, but the old Pink Delight is still one that I consider a good bet. There are crepe myrtles now that provide not just our typical showy bloom, but the dark foliage for interest. And I've really enjoyed some of these, the Razzle series, Razzle Dazzles and the Magics. So the foliage is part of the charm, even when they're not in flower. I'm not particularly a fan so far of the growth habits, and I haven't seen ones that have particularly good fall color. But again, we're still getting many, many months of interest. Oh, I had to show you the purple foliage on my Ruby Falls at my house with a Saryu Japanese maple there to your left, and a very handsome catfish being the spokesmodel for my Ruby Falls that exactly echoed the color of my gazing ball there. All right, bragging over. Another thing I found that I like to recommend for year-round bloom, I mean virtually year-round, certainly season-long, and that is the Major Wheeler native honeysuckle. And your hummingbird people are going to love this plant because it starts blooming early, it blooms heavily in the spring, continues to bloom throughout the summer in little bursts. You know, every time it starts to slow down, give it a good drink of water, a little pop of fertilizer, maybe a couple of times, and it will bloom. And even into late winter, and even tries to bloom whenever we have warm spells in winter. So this is a great, great plant for pretty much continuous flower. There are some of those newer butterfly bushes. They're trying to breed for more vivid colors, the Miss Mollies and Miss Rubies, which certainly do have that richer tone. Don't forget our abelias. Abelias are going to give us long seasons of bloom. A lot of them have bright variegated foliage, and they're going to really please our pollinators. So that would be another option, as well as the foliage opportunities. In the perennial realm, instead of a knockout, we might consider some long blooming perennials. So our hardy lantana over here in Zone 7 in West Tennessee, we've got ham and eggs shown here, and Miss Huff, which are going to start blooming by, you know, late spring, early summer, and bloom all the way till we have a really hard frost. So that would be an option, even though they do die down to the ground in the winter and have to start anew. I mentioned hydrangeas already and abelias, sorry. So I'm going to preach diversify, 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 so we don't have these problems, but we're not creating these, you know, perfect opportunities for these pests or disease to grow strong and be more devastating than ever. Let's mix it up. Let's decide, instead of having to spray so often, we can choose the plants that don't require as much, and these diversified plantings can be so beautiful. Just a variety of plant materials, different textures, shapes, sizes, backdrops. They can provide privacy at the same time. This just is a harder way to landscape because you're going to have to spec out more different plants and more different ways to treat them and site them. But you'll be the smarter for it, and you'll earn a reputation for that as the better landscaper who deserves more money, right? Choose the right plants for the site, you know, those hot, dry sites, and then those plants that deserve a little bit of special care, like our dogwoods here in fall color, and make sure that those plants that may have some issues, even if we choose the right spot, we know that we can use them anyway. I hope that was helpful to you today, and hope that you picked up the points you need to pass the test. Thank you for listening to this virtual presentation.